Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, my guest today is somebody who was at the very forefront of the fight to maintain free speech. He's been on the show before. I'm delighted he's back. Toby Young, of course, is a well-known columnist, best-selling author. He also was the founder of Daily Skeptic 1 year ago. The Free Speech Union, which he founded 2 years ago, has become one of the great forces in the battle that we face. I know that sounds rather grand, but I mean, it is a very big issue, Toby. But before we talk about the Free Speech Union, I wonder, when it comes to all the restrictions coming off this week and the general feeling in the air of people backing away from their past stance, I just wonder, do you feel vindicated in your position?
I think I do, broadly speaking, Peter. So, I set up a website called Lockdown Skeptics in the beginning of April 2020, so within a week of the first lockdown being imposed. And it was partly because I'd written a piece for The Critic saying I thought the lockdown was a mistake and would inevitably cause more harm than good. Which was a fairly controversial and minority view at the time. And I'd also written something similar for The Telegraph, and I got completely monstered on Twitter, lots of rude emails, friends kind of distancing themselves from me. It wasn't like, being well and truly cancelled, which I was in 2018, but it was like a sort of, a sort of minor version of that. And it occurred to me that there was no forum for people to express their dissent about what was happening. Everyone just seemed to accept that this was the appropriate and proper response, the only way to deal with a pandemic of this nature, which was extraordinary because the lockdown policy had never really been tried in the way it was at the beginning of 2020 anywhere else in the world in response to a pandemic ever. And it had even been recommended against in a paper by the WHO in 2019, and it certainly wasn't part of the pandemic preparedness strategy, which was our official strategy for dealing with a viral outbreak. So it was extraordinary to me that this draconian, unprecedented intervention should have been just accepted by everyone as, the completely natural response. But nonetheless, there was no opportunity for anyone very few opportunities for people to express their dissent, particularly people, academics, people in the medical profession and so forth. So I thought I'd start Lockdown Skeptics to create this forum. It ended up taking over my life. I mean, it became we produced a daily update of all the stories we'd published the day before, as well as a summary of all the stories in the news and elsewhere about the pandemic.
I read it all the time.
And it's and doing it almost killed me. I mean, it was I would be working on it sort of 14, 15 hours a day. I ended up sleeping in my garden shed because I was going to bed so late I would have woken up my wife if I'd gone to bed at sort of 5 a.m. and I wanted to sleep in the morning and not be woken up by the kids. But it was like I would drag myself out of my bed, get up, sit in front of my laptop and just be there stuck to it, maybe having a bowl of soup for half an hour, and then just kind of collapse at 4:35 a.m. and then get up and do it all over again. But it felt, important to do it because there were so few voices of dissent at that time challenging the kind of prevailing narrative. Eventually I found other people to help, and I relied on donations. It's always just relied on donations from well-wishers, and that became enough to then employ a couple of people to help me do it. And now I've turned it into a company, and it's become the Daily Skeptic, and it has 4 employees, including myself. We had our record month in the month of January. We had 2 million plus page views, which is, it's more than the Morning Star, the New Statesman, and Novara media combined. It probably doesn't compare with your figures, Peter, but for a kind of, for a cottage industry produced out of my garden shed, it's been extraordinarily successful.
When you are sort of like really going against the tide, I wouldn't say of whole opinion, but as you just described it, what's it like actually, Toby, for that? I mean, you're pretty strong-minded, obviously. I mean, but do you feel embattled ever? I mean, do you sort of think, what am I doing this for? You know.
Sometimes it's difficult to be, very much on the outside, and you have to deal with, not just polite counter-arguments, but an enormous amount of personal abuse. But I think, as a journalist, particularly, an iconoclastic, irreverent journalist, you become accustomed to, attracting a bit of hate mail. And I'd sort of gone through the ringer at the beginning of 2018 when I was well and truly cancelled and had to step down from 5 positions. So, I was sort of inured to it by then. I wouldn't say I've, got the hide of a rhinoceros, but I'm probably, more thick-skinned than average. It's tough when, I think it's really tough when your family begin to notice that it's happening and your kind of kids get abuse, I've never been an anti-vaxxer, but often people who are lockdown skeptics get kind of smeared as COVID skeptics or anti-vaxxers. And my kids said that, friends of theirs at school would say, "Why is your dad an anti-vaxxer?" Again, that becomes, when it sort of creeps into, your domestic life in that way, it can become quite testing. But for the most part, that doesn't happen. And one of the rewards of staking out these controversial dissenting positions is that sometimes the rest of the world gradually comes around to your point of view. I'm not sure that's entirely happened yet when it comes to the lockdowns, but it looks as though it's heading in that direction. Certainly amongst the general public, amongst the kind of journalistic class within the Westminster bubble, there isn't anything like as much enthusiasm for COVID restrictions as there was, 2 years ago. And people come up with a number of kind of rationalizations to kind of explain why they've kind of, changed their minds, and sometimes quite plausible explanations. But I'm beginning to think that, the direction of the tide is turning.
Yes, I mean, I think, you're reading things like perhaps we were too harsh, or, that sort of thing. Perhaps looking back, we were maybe too harsh. But were you dismayed, or did you expect fellow journalists, taken as a whole, particularly broadcast media, I have to say, seemed so unquestioning? I mean, you would think, wouldn't you, any reporter worth their salt, would question, well, first of all, where this thing's come from, and no one seemed to want to talk at all about that, and whether these things like lockdowns actually work.
I know, that point, Peter, it was extraordinary that there was so little intellectual curiosity about the origins of the virus, and anyone speculating that it might have been leaked from, the Virology Institute in Wuhan was, for a long time smeared as a conspiracy theorist trafficking in misinformation. And that kind of smear was enough to kind of shut down debate about it for more than a year. And, we now know the story of how that was partly orchestrated by various senior scientists and scientific gatekeepers who didn't want to antagonize their Chinese allies, shall we say. I was disappointed by my colleagues in the mainstream media for not challenging the official narrative more energetically. I mean, there were pockets. Peter Hitchens in the Mail on Sunday, Alison Pearson in the Daily Telegraph. There were some kind of heroic, people who stood out from the crowd and genuinely questioned what was happening. I was really impressed by Lord Sumption, who I think was, risking quite a lot in staking out that territory because it was so at odds with the kind of prevailing view within his kind of, intellectual class and his peers. And I think that was a large part of it. I think, you ask yourself, well, why did so many mainstream journalists toe the line, effectively, just accept the official narrative at face value, in many cases just regurgitate propaganda that was being kind of churned out by Downing Street with the help of the Behavioural Insights team. And I think lots of people think it must be part of, a conspiracy, and they point to the fact that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funds some journalists on The Guardian and on The Telegraph and so forth, and imagine that kind of, these journalists are kind of part of this kind of, global conspiracy headed up by Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and the rest of it. I don't think that's it. I think it's. I mean, if it was that, that would sort of, in some ways, be kind of, well, it would certainly be more understandable. I think I don't think they needed to be bribed. It was just groupthink. A lot of it was status signaling. I think, if it became very quickly established that if you were a dissenter, if you didn't buy into lockdowns, and if you weren't completely convinced that the vaccines were the solution when the vaccines were rolled out at the beginning of last year, you were immediately tagged as a sort of deplorable. You were someone who wasn't properly educated. You had something in common with the kind of animal skin wearing kind of protesters who stormed the Capitol on January the 6th. Yeah, it was like being a Brexiteer but worse. I mean, there was certainly an effort by Remainers to kind of smear Brexiteers as sort of beyond the pale, as these sort of knuckle-dragging troglodytes, racists, but it seemed to be more effective at shutting down any kind of dissent from the kind of COVID orthodoxy over the past 2 years, and it became a kind of if it was, I think, lots of senior journalists, people like, I don't want to name names, but I think that it was a way to, going along with the narrative was a way of signalling that they were a member of the kind of ruling elite. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about the last 2 years was it wasn't just that people, journalists, kind of didn't challenge the prevailing orthodoxy, but they saw it as their job to enforce compliance with the kind of public health coronavirus regulations. They thought that they were doing good by doing that, but also it was a way of aligning themselves with the kind of responsible class, with the metropolitan elite, a way of signalling that you were, a member of this kind of responsible, this custodian class. I mean, it was sort of. But I think it was largely that. It was kind of groupthink, status signaling, wanting to do something in this crisis, feeling it was the right thing to do. Often there's a kind of overlap between virtue signaling and status signaling. I think it's that rather than anything more sinister. It's just a kind of failure of kind of what's the word? Sort of absence of any critical thinking, really.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say, I would agree with that. What I found interesting when the restrictions came, or Plan B or whatever came off last week, I have to say that just for a while, in my sentimental way, I mentioned Brexit. I did have just a glimmer of pride. I thought, my God, this country's the first one to do this. Somehow, by some kind of strange, circuitous kind of genius, we somehow been the first to actually become free again, as it were. Just before we leave the subject, I wonder, when it comes to the whole Boris thing and the parties, the general force of argument has been about the shocking hypocrisy, shorthand there. But my feeling is that the basic part, the most important point, is that they didn't believe themselves in it. I mean, would you agree with that or not? Do you think it's just a case of, oh, well, yes, this is what we have to do, but well, we'll get round it? Or do you think it's actually that they never really believed in it?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, Peter. I mean, could you say the same thing about Neil Ferguson, the leader of the Imperial College modelling team, whose apocalyptic projections in March 2020 prompted Boris and his cabinet to do a U-turn and impose the first national lockdown, and also, I think, influenced the decision to lock down around the world. And then was later caught out having an affair with a married woman, even while he had just tested positive for coronavirus. And you sort of think to yourself, well, does that mean that he doesn't think these restrictions are actually going to interrupt transmission and are kind of pointless? And why has he been? And I don't think so. And I don't think in the case of Downing Street either. I think it's just they think the rules are for the good of the general population, and that it's in the interests of the country for everyone to comply with those rules. But they don't think the rules apply to them. They think, from a sort of utilitarian perspective, I suppose, that if I break a couple of rules here and there, it won't make a big dent in the general good that the rules are doing. Is it that? I mean, maybe it's a degree of cognitive dissonance that they think that I'm an intelligent, educated person, so I can make a kind of risk-benefit calculation myself. But these kind of uneducated masses, they need me to tell them what to do and to order them to stay in their homes because they're incapable of making that kind of calculation themselves. I mean, something which was clearly wrong, as we've seen in countries where they've had less draconian restrictions and no greater COVID death toll than us, like Sweden. But it's hard to know why they were so cavalier and behaved so flagrantly, hypocritically. I mean, I was thinking about, the party, one of the parties that Sue Gray is investigating and apparently is being investigated by the Metropolitan Police, which was the party held in Carrie's flat, at which ABBA's Winner Takes It All was supposedly played because Dominic Cummings had just departed, and it's sort of presented as a reference to Carrie triumphant in her battle with Dom. And you sort of think, my God, could there have been anything more hubristic than holding a party where you play Winner Takes It All to celebrate your victory over Dominic Cummings, and in the act of doing that, the very act of doing that, you're handing Dominic Cummings the gun that he's going to use to assassinate you. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. But of course, it's hubris, it's arrogance, it's thinking the rules don't apply to them. Maybe it's sort of an acknowledgement. People read it as an acknowledgement on their part that the rules were entirely pointless and completely ineffective, and they just wanted to be seen to be doing something for kind of Machiavellian political reasons. Didn't actually think they'd make any sort of impact on interrupting transmission. And maybe that's partly true. I'm not close enough to it, but I've always thought that Boris was fairly sceptical about the benefits of the lockdowns, and and that's part of Dominic Cummings's sort of narrative is that that Boris was he wobbled, he dragged his heels, he didn't want to do it, he didn't think it was really important, and I've always rather liked that about Boris, and I sort of think now for all his shortcomings, he got Brexit done, but he did his best to get Brexit done, although Brexit hasn't entirely been done, and I'm not sure that any successor wouldn't kind of, try and do a reverse ferret of some kind, leave a lot of loose ends untied. So there's that consideration. But I also think that, bad though he has been, and disappointing though his acquiescence to the various lockdowns was, he did at least stand up to all the kind of bedwetting hysterics and release all the restrictions on July 19th of last year, Freedom Day, in spite of the apocalyptic warnings from, Sage, Independent Sage, their kind of obedient chorus in the mainstream media. Nonetheless, Boris stuck to his guns on that one, turned out absolutely fine. And again, the attempt to go further than Plan B restrictions in the run-up to Christmas, impose a Christmas lockdown. I mean, maybe Boris doesn't deserve all the credit for that. I mean, I saw a piece in the Mail on Sunday in which Rishi Sunak had clearly briefed, their chief political correspondent, saying, no, that was all me, staying Boris's hand, me and Jacob and Lord Frost. But nonetheless, he did, as the kind of decision maker, he decided not to go beyond Plan B, and that turned out to be absolutely the right decision. And you sort of think now, having seen Sage and others cry wolf twice.
Yeah.
When they cry wolf a third time, Boris is going to be fairly reluctant to listen to them, which I think is good. Also, I think the fact that he himself broke the rules makes it much harder for him to insist everyone else obey them again. I mean, you can't imagine a political leader across the West for whom it would be politically more difficult to impose another lockdown. So I think for that reason he should be kept in office. But I also think that bad though he's been, it's hard to find another leader who's been better. I mean, maybe the Prime Minister of Sweden, Ron DeSantis in Florida, but there are very few political leaders to emerge with any credit over the last 2 years, and I do think Boris is one of the few, one of the least bad at any rate. So even though he's been terrible, he's been better than almost every other Western political leader.
During this whole period of restriction, of physical restriction, we've also had a growth, I would say, in psychological restriction coming from different angles. I mean, and it sounds fanciful, but over the past 2 years, obviously, in terms of free speech, in terms of the kind of growing woke agenda, that has sort of placed, again, another restriction. So people have been physically restricted, but also they're increasingly worried about what they can and cannot say. This has grown, and that's a rather clunky segue into talking about the Free Speech Union, or the FSU, as we refer to it. It was 2 years ago this month that you founded it, wasn't it? Sorry, 2 months. Sorry, 2 years ago this month, February, that you founded it. Why did you do it, actually, to begin with? Why did you start it? Was it because of your own counselling?
Yes, in part anyway. So when I found myself, twisting on the end of the kind of pitchfork wielded by a mob, I was very conscious that there was no organisation to turn to for help, to give me impartial, professional, legal and sort of PR advice. When you find yourself in that situation, you can see your career that you've spent 25 plus years building up on fire, literally burning to the ground. And it's quite panic inducing, and you really want some sort of guidance as to, should I throw some sand on it? Do I kind of get a fire hose and try and put it out? Where do I direct the stream? And there's nothing, really, no organisation to provide you with that kind of advice. You're getting a lot of conflicting advice from all directions. And I thought, when I sort of came through it, that it would be great to set up an organisation that did precisely that. People who find themselves targeted for cancellation, being put through an investigation in the workplace or at a university, people who are being punished, penalised in some way for exercising their lawful right to free speech, who've kind of whipped up this kind of angry, feverish kind of mob. An organisation they can turn to that can provide them with some calm, reasonable, professional assistance, tell them what the best thing they can do is. And that was really the kind of wellspring of the idea. But yeah.
In that case, actually, it really is a union, isn't it? I mean, it is a union just as much as the firefighters union or whatever. People come to you. They join it, don't they? They join it. And then, so how does it work, actually, for people who want to join?
Yeah, it's a membership organisation, and you can join for as little as $24.95 a year, and you can stagger that over monthly payments. The standard fee is $49.95 for full membership. And in addition to, it's like an insurance policy, I suppose. If something happens to you, we can provide you with a whole suite of services, including legal support if, that's discretionary. But if we judge that it's an important, winnable case, we'll provide you with legal support. And we have a full-time chief legal counsel, a legal officer who works 4 days a week. And an incredible amount of our time is taken up with managing fighting various legal cases. I mean, we're behaving like a kind of medium-sized...
How many are you talking about, actually, like on a daily basis?
We've got about, I'd say, 24 cases unfolding simultaneously. and we get about 50 cries for help a week, I'd say, to our, either to our hotline or to our help inbox, and we end up helping about half of them. But we don't just do casework. That's about 50% of what we do. We also organise events. They've mainly been sort of online events up until now, but we're beginning to organise some in-person events. We also have a research and a kind of briefing arm, doing a bit of lobbying. So it's sort of growing. But as you say, it's like a trade union. It's not legally a trade union, but it is like a trade union.
Yeah.
And one of the great benefits of trade unions, back in the 19th century when they were first formed, is that they would protect people who wanted to say things which weren't against the law, but which were likely to get them into trouble. They're going to criticise their bosses, criticise working conditions. And unions seem to have lost sight, for the most part, of that role of protecting the speech rights of workers. And that creates a kind of real opportunity for us to move in to that space and do that.
It was quite interesting. I was having a quiet glass of wine in my local Wetherspoons not that long ago, and they produce a magazine in Wetherspoons, and on the back of I think it was the back, there was a whole article by you about the Free Speech Union, about the threat to free speech, and I just thought, I have to say to it, I thought, that is enviable outreach. I mean, here you are in all the... Did you get much of a response from that?
It was incredible. I got a better response to that piece than anything else I've ever written. It was extraordinary. I mean, hundreds of people, who just read it in a Wetherspoons, who wouldn't normally have heard of it, contacted me and said, "This sounds fantastic. How do I join?" Or lots of people say, "I got into trouble for saying this. Can you help?" We ended up helping some of them. That's been an extraordinarily effective bit of outreach.
What would you say? We had Harry Miller on quite recently again, just after he'd had his Court of Appeal victory on that particular, on the non-crime hate incidents point. When it comes to what you've been doing over the past 2 years, what's been your biggest success, do you think, or most significant in your mind?
We were a little bit involved in Harry Miller's case. So we had said to Harry, when he was weighing up whether to appeal the High Court decision to the Court of Appeal, the High Court decision was great from his point of view, but it could have been even better, because even though Justice Knowles condemned Humberside Police as the Gestapo and said they shouldn't have investigated Harry's thinking, for retweeting a comic verse about trans people. Nonetheless, the judge in the High Court said that the College of Policing's guidance, which Humberside Police were following, was lawful. And so Harry challenged that in the Court of Appeal, and when he was weighing up whether to do that, the risk was that he'd lose and there'd be a costs order given against him and he'd be in the hole for, a lot of money. So we said, look, if we'll back you. So, if that happens, we'll help you pay those adverse costs. And I think that helped him make up his mind to challenge it in the Court of Appeal. And we would have been, out of pocket in a big way had he lost, but thankfully he won. He deserves, all the credit. I mean, he's an extraordinary, courageous and tenacious man and has struck a huge blow for free speech by winning both those cases. I mean, NCHI's non-crime hate incidents are still there. Yeah. And the next step, lots of people, and when I say lots, I mean, probably close to 200,000 people in England and Wales have non-crime hate incidents recorded against their names, which will show up on their criminal records in some cases when prospective employers, voluntary organisations they apply to work with, do enhanced DBS checks on them. So they're still there. Yeah. I mean, it may be that fewer are now being recorded, perhaps not even any are being recorded until the College of Policing revises its NCHI guidance to comply with the Court of Appeal's verdict. But nonetheless, these need to be expunged. And one great victory earlier this week was that one of the Fair Cop, Harry's organisation, helped get a non-crime hate incident expunged from a woman's record.
Yes. Is this the case of the lady with the book that was taken away by the police? Or
no, it's a different one.
It's a different one.
We are now going to, I think, say to all our members, if you want us to write to the police, if you think you've got an NCHI recorded against your name, we will write to them and ask them to expunge it. And if they don't, we'll threaten legal action, which is how Fair Cop succeeded in this particular case. And I think we'll publish an FAQs on our website too, just telling anyone, member or not, how to go about. Here's a template letter to write, because it's really it's a scandal that nearly 200,000 people have blighted employment prospects merely because they've exercised their lawful right to free speech, oftentimes engaged, robustly in a debate about, trans rights or something similar. They have to go.
Yes. Is there some, obviously, it's very clear what you do and what you offer, but is there a sort of a legal thing? Is there anything in the legal field, a law or some such, which in your view and the FSG's view has to either go or change? Is there a specific, in other words, have you got an aim to somehow or other get something scrapped or revised?
Well, you'd be amazed, Peter. I mean, when I, set up the Free Speech Union, I thought we'd be campaigning, that most of our campaigning energy would be consumed by trying to repeal existing restrictions on free speech on the statute book. And I didn't imagine, at that stage, February 2020, that things could get much worse. But actually, they then got worse by an order of magnitude, partly as a result of the pandemic, which resulted in a huge amount of, lawful speech being suppressed. We saw it last week with Joe Rogan. But in addition, the Black Lives Matter movement. Suddenly it became absolutely taboo to challenge any of these kind of wild, completely unevidenced claims being made by kind of anti-racist activists. And we saw lots and lots of people who we came to the aid of who got into trouble for challenging in the most reasonable evidence-based way some of these claims. Nick Buckley, good example.
Yes.
He was one of our great successes quite early on. So he wrote a blog post. I mean, I'm sure you know the story.
You've had him on the
show.
But he just criticised the aims as stated on their website of BLM, didn't he?
That's right. Yeah, he didn't appeal to anything other than what BLM said on its own website, and it said things like wanting to end capitalism, dismantle the nuclear family, defund the police, and so forth. And he was monstered, and the charity that he had set up then fired him as chief executive. I mean, really extraordinarily kind of cowardly behaviour on their part. And we found him. I called him, said, "Can we help?" He said, "Well, maybe you can." We found him an experienced charity solicitor who agreed to do the work pro bono. Eventually got Nick reinstated to that job, and all the trustees resigned one after another. So that was a huge victory, and I'm delighted to see that Nick has gone from strength to strength after that. But to go back to my original point, I thought we'd be campaigning to, repeal those laws but actually most of our campaigning energy has been devoted to stopping things getting worse. I mean, good example is the online safety bill. I'm sure you've discussed it many times. But that's
safety, by the way, it was once called something.
It was called the Online Harms Bill originally. It's become more kind of, it's been changed to, perhaps with the advice of the Behavioural Insights team to make it more palatable.
We've had her on too, Laura. She wrote all about the nudge theory. Laura Dodsworth. With this online safety bill, then, what is it that you would campaign to? What you think it should be scrapped, or just revised, or what?
Well, it's often a tricky judgment call when thinking about these bits of legislation. Do you just outright oppose it, on principle, and kind of make that argument in the public square, knowing that it'll probably happen anyway? Or do you think about, what you can do pragmatically to improve it, even though it's a pretty ghastly piece of legislation? And I tend to go with a more pragmatic approach. So I think it's politically unstoppable. It's going to happen. Doesn't matter how energetically we campaign against it, how much we try to mobilise opposition to it. There seems to be so much political momentum behind it. And if you look at other countries, Germany, Spain, New Zealand, very similar legislation has either been passed or is going through the kind of parliamentary legislative sausage machine. So I don't think we can stop it, but I think we can improve it significantly. And one way in which we can improve it is that the Law Commission of England and Wales has proposed various reforms to communications law. So it would repeal the Malicious Communications Act, which is a pretty egregious piece of legislation, and replace all the communications offences with a single harms-based communications offence. And this would enshrine the principle that it is the business of the state to protect people from psychological harm. And that is a pernicious principle. And me and Lord Sumption had a bit of a barney about that at Ditchley Park last week. He's just dead against it, which I'm sure is the right position to hold. But my pragmatic view is, OK, let's accept this recommendation of the Law Commission, because what they're proposing isn't as bad as the various bits of legislation it would be replacing. Let's try and define psychological harm incredibly narrowly and precisely. Let's include the Law Commission's proposals in the Online Safety Bill and make sure there's a read across throughout the bill of that definition of harm. So internet companies, Ofcom, cannot just pluck things out of the air and say they're harmful. They can't just respond to politically motivated complainants saying, I was harmed by hearing this gender-critical point of view by Kathleen Stock, and it shouldn't be on the internet. It should include, across the bill, embedded in the bill, should be this very narrow, very precise definition of legal harm. And the only things internet companies, social media companies should be obliged to remove by Ofcom should be content that meets the threshold for criminal prosecution under this new harms-based communications offence. Anything short of that should not be removed, and if social media companies remove it, then there should be a right of appeal, and they should be fined as much as they are for leaving it on if they remove it, if they shouldn't remove it, if it doesn't meet that criminal threshold.
So that it's a very specific thing. So basically, this is the lobbying part of what you do, isn't it?
Yes.
So, I mean, essentially, people always ask this, our viewers ask this, how does one do this? In your case, you have to build up enough influence, presumably, with government and with MPs in order to take this on board and to change it. That's what you have to do. That is a very long process, is it not?
It is a long process. We have a legislative affairs director part-time.
Right.
And it's work when I was involved in education, I was involved in a certain amount of lobbying then, and I was head of the New Schools Network. So it's not completely unfamiliar territory. But I also think that with many members of the parliamentary Conservative Party, you're pushing at an open door. There are lots of Conservative MPs, particularly amongst the red wall seat holders, who are very pro-free speech, very concerned about the erosion of free speech, across various sectors. So there's a lot of kind of sympathy there. There's an audience there willing to listen. And I think with the Online Safety Bill, I think there's certainly scope to improve it dramatically. Right. But I don't think there's scope to get it scrapped altogether. I mean, another thing that could be done to improve it is, at the moment, there is a reference to social media companies, search engine companies, having a due regard. They need to have a due regard for free speech. But due regard is the weakest of the legal duties, and it's certainly weaker than this duty of care they'll have to their users to prevent psychological harm befalling them. Adult users, not just children. And it's been designed that way, so in the event of a conflict between free speech and safety's going to win. And they won't have to, Ofcom, when kind of adjudicate, when scrutinising the decisions made by search engines, it won't be a tough judgment call, because it'll be clear in the bill, safety, psychological safety takes priority over free speech. We want to get that due regard strengthened. Right. So free speech at least is given the same weight by social media companies and ultimately by Ofcom when judging whether they've got these calls right.
This applies to England, right? The English legal system, in the sense that obviously Scotland's got a different legal system. I mean, the reason I was asking is that some of the things coming out now from Scotland on the issue of free speech just make the blood run cold. I mean, there's domestic hate speech whereby, you know, if you say something at home which could be called hate speech, you know, this somehow it's now going to be illegal. It's unbelievable to me, Toby, but presumably that's the sort of thing you would campaign against, but it's in Scotland. Well, do you operate only in...
We are raising our profile in Scotland. We had a conference in Scotland in November of last year, and there was, you won't be surprised to learn, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of support from some, you know, pretty senior people for a much bigger presence for the Free Speech Union north of the border. And we're going to have another conference in April, and we're going to launch a campaign, and we're looking at what that campaign issue should be. And one of the things we're looking at is challenging the Scottish Hate Crime and Public Order Act under the European Convention on Human Rights. And it remains to be seen how challengeable it is, whether a challenge along those lines would succeed. But the really alarming thing, Peter, is not just that Scotland now probably has the least free speech than any other country in Europe. Fewer legal protections for free speech than any other country in Europe, including Hungary, because this bill's been passed. But the Law Commission of England and Wales, in another proposal, has proposed a hate crime bill almost identical to the Scottish one for England and Wales. It actually goes further than the Scottish one. In the original Scottish hate crime bill, the proposal was that people should be, you should be able to prosecute people for stirring up hatred, not just against the current three categories of protected people, which is on racial grounds, religious grounds, or sexual orientation. But they wanted to vastly increase the number of protected characteristics you can be prosecuted for stirring up hatred against. And at the same time, this was originally in the Scottish bill, remove the necessity for the prosecution to show intent. So if your words had the likely effect of stirring up hatred against one of these protected groups, then that would be enough to secure a prosecution, regardless of whether you intended them to have that effect or not. That was in the debate about the bill in Holyrood. That went, so that's gone. That's not in the Scottish Hate Crime and Public Order Act. You still have to show intent. You will have to secure a prosecution for stirring up hatred in Scotland. In the Law Commission of England and Wales's proposal, they have also proposed that intent shouldn't be necessary to secure a prosecution. It's not necessary in the case of stirring up racial hatred at the moment, but that's the exception. If you want to secure a conviction against anyone for stirring up hatred against another protected group, you have to show intent. And the Law Commission's argument, well, for consistency's sake, you know, just to make it all consistent, let's not make it necessary to show intent in any case, and let's vastly increase the number of protected characteristics. I mean, it's a horrible proposal which will have a really chilling effect on free speech. But at the moment, as things stand, if this English and Welsh hate crime bill is passed in Westminster as proposed, it'll actually be worse than the Scottish Hate Crime and Public Order Act. I mean, it's extraordinary. You know, given the fuss that was made of seeing that, you know, all the criticisms that Nicola Sturgeon attracted for passing that bill, you know, totalitarian one-party state. For the Law Commission, it's so tone deaf to think, let's have the same thing in England and Wales, but let's make it even more draconian. And that's a battle facing us. And, you know, just as a coda to this, a very similar proposal has been made in Northern Ireland. It's not quite at the same stage as the proposals for England and Wales are yet, but it's getting to the same stage. We're about to publish a paper opposing this proposed Northern Irish hate crime bill. I mean, it's incredible how you think kind of, again, it's sort of, you think, is there some kind of cabal, orchestrating this kind of assault on free speech? Because similar bills have been passed, across the world. There's another bill, very similar, going through the New Zealand Parliament at the moment. In various US states, similar laws have been passed. Again, removing the need for people to show intent in order to prosecute someone for hate speech directed against a protected group. I mean, but I think it's just groupthink. I mean, they all go to the same academic conferences, they read the same books, but this kind of woke virus, it just kind of seems to jump from person to person without requiring kind of central coordination, partly as a result of, social media.
With the English and Welsh proposal from the Law Commission, this is a battle you say you're going to have to fight, but at what stage are they then, Toby, in the sense of, like, how much time have you got?
Well, the Joint Parliamentary Committee, which recently published its recommendations about what should be changed about the online safety bill, proposed that many of the things that the Law Commission wanted to include in an English and Welsh hate crime bill be included in the online safety bill, including this the enlargement of the number of protected groups you can be prosecuted for stirring up hatred against, as well as the proposal that it shouldn't be necessary to show intent in order to secure a prosecution. That was the recommendation of the Joint Parliamentary Committee, which scrutinised the online safety bill, and they've said, these recommendations should be included in this bill. And that bill could come before Parliament, and that recommendation could be followed up, in the next few weeks. So we haven't got much time. No.
I think you might have answered my question, actually, but I was going to ask you, sort of by way of ending, where you see the greatest threat to free speech coming from now. I mean, generally. For me, it's quite a, it's not actually even a thing. But various surveys have shown recently that young people no longer actually really even care or believe in the concept of free speech. I know that you've written, I'm sure, about this, but certain things are far more important to them. So it's not even a case of, oh, yes, of course I believe in free speech, but, the old one used to get that. Now they really don't even believe it. To me, that's the biggest threat we face, actually. Yeah. But would you agree with that, or is there something else?
No, I think that's right. We keep winning battles at the Free Speech Union. 75% of the cases we take on, we win, but we're losing the war. I read the other day about all these multi-academy trusts involving hundreds of schools, primary and secondary schools, introducing kind of mandatory anti-racism lessons, which effectively silence anyone who doesn't kind of sign up to the kind of BLM ideological agenda. I mean, extraordinary and possibly even unlawful under the Education Act 1996, which prohibits political indoctrination of children. Yeah. You see this kind of thing happening in schools up and down the country. I mean, it's worse typically in Scotland than it is in England. And we saw Brighton and Hove kind of proposing similar.
Oh, the racial lack of innocence, 7-year-olds.
7-year-olds. I mean, and you think kind of every time you win a battle, you then realise that, this is just the tip. What you're seeing, these victories are at the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface, the war is being won by the kind of massed armies of these kind of woke fanatics. And what can we do about it? Well, as you say, it's essentially a cultural problem. And I think, law is downstream from culture. And one of the successes of the enemies of free speech is that they've successfully created the impression that they're on the right side of history. This is the direction of travel. People like you and I are antediluvian, Buffton Tufton types who haven't understood, why free speech is harmful to kind of historically marginalized groups, and why, if we want to bring them into the conversation, the speech of people like you and I has to be restricted. history's on their side, and that's a very powerful argument. I think that that was one of the things which did for the Soviet Union and the kind of communist control system across Eastern Europe in 1989. The feeling that, they were on the wrong side of history, that their experiment had failed. It's a tremendously powerful political narrative. If you can persuade people this is the direction of travel, you need to go along with it. It's a way of getting people to do. You don't really think it's inevitable. You have to tell them it's inevitable to persuade them to do your bidding to make it inevitable. But that's been a powerful kind of argument, and we need to challenge that. We need to persuade people that the erosion of free speech, prioritizing emotional and psychological safety and well-being over the robust exchange of ideas, that's not inevitable. And persuading young people of that is that's the real challenge. And the Free Speech Union's been involved with the Battle of Ideas in setting up something called the Free Speech Champions Programme, trying to identify young people on campuses willing to get out there and make the argument. When Eric Kaufman did some research about how little enthusiasm there was for free speech amongst students for, I think, policy exchange last year, maybe the year before. One thing he discovered was that if you read students out a kind of short passage, just making the basic case for free speech, pointing out why it's important and why it should matter to them, many of them changed their minds and became quite enthusiastic about free speech. And that was the sort of wellspring of the Free Speech Champions Programme. But it suggests that one of the reasons young people aren't more pro-free speech is they just haven't heard the arguments. The other side has successfully suppressed any opposition to their kind of woke fanaticism, often by threatening to cancel people who do challenge it. But if you can just get voices out there, if you can just make the argument in the public square in a way that young people will listen to, maybe you can persuade them that it isn't inevitable. There isn't such thing as the tide of history. History is what you make it. The future's in their hands, and it's important that they should defend free speech. And if you look at teenagers, this is the source of hope, I think. It's mainly anecdotal at this stage, but you look at 13, 14, 15-year-olds. They're beginning, I think, to bridle at all these restrictions on what they can say. Cancel culture's become almost a joke to them. If someone says something they disagree with, they say, "Oh, I'm going to cancel you for that." It's not surprising if any teenager has got a bit about them, given that their parents, their teachers, the BBC, everybody is kind of churning out the same propaganda day after day. Of course they're going to start to push back a little bit against it. And I think you're beginning to see that. And, it's remarkable how often young people contact, the Free Speech Union and say, am I old enough to join? I recently discovered this Canadian psychologist you may not have heard of on YouTube called Jordan Peterson, and a lot of what he says makes a great deal of sense to me. And I'm thinking,
Well, look, that's very, very heartening. In fact, it's very interesting, actually, Toby. You say that the sort of stuff that's being put out now by academies and schools, which might actually even be illegal, this sort of stuff. I've got a family member who's actually in this very position at the moment. She doesn't want her kids to have to go and listen to identity politics stuff and everything. And the teachers, in fact, said, well, it's actually a legal requirement. So I think we will look into that and see if it really is. Toby, thank you so much for that. It was very much a root and branch explanation exactly of what people can do and how you can help them. When it comes to the website, it's the freespeechunion.org.uk, is it?
It's just the freespeechunion.org.
.org, freespeechunion.org. And again, to join, it is you've got a sliding scale.
Yeah. So if you're the standard price is about £50 a year, but if you're a veteran or a student or a pensioner, it's 25.
Okay, there you go. Congratulations on 2 years of it, anyway, Toby.
Thank you.
Fantastic what you're doing. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Peter.
There you go. I'm sure we'll speak to Toby in about a year's time, I hope, if he comes back. We shall see you next time. So thank you very much. Bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme. at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.